And then, just to be absolutely clear that we know what kind of a leader this is, the next day Jesus comes back. He sees the fig tree just across from the temple. It's really a sign of the temple, and he curses it. It's his only negative miracle. Then he cleanses the temple, and then he sees that the fig tree has withered. So in 2005, Joe Posnanski, the sports writer, spent a year traveling around with Buck O'Neil. It is almost impossible to capture the beauty and the passion of this man, but Posnanski came pretty close in his book, The Soul of Baseball. Um, Buck O'Neil, of course, played for the Monarchs. He started in 38. He played for a dozen years. Then he managed the team and took them to a couple of titles. And then the Negro Leagues, eventually folded as black players were admitted to the major leagues. And so then Buck O'Neil went on to become a scout for the Chicago Cubs, and he joined their coaching staff as the first African American to be on a major league coaching staff. Then he came back to Kansas City, where he was a scout for the Royals and lived here until his death in 2006. This was his home. And everywhere he went, he took his amazing life and love and passion and joy everywhere he went, and his energy. When Posnanski was traveling the country for a year with him, Buck was already 93, and he was making 200 appearances a year, sometimes 3 or 4 appearances a day. He would go anywhere from Nicodemus, Kansas to New York City to speak about the Negro Leagues, to pump up the museum, to promote players, trying to get them in the Hall of Fame, and to promote all kinds of amazing causes in the city that kind of brought God's justice and peace closer. And everywhere he went with color and flair. He didn't just show up. He'd show up in lemon yellow or robin's egg blue. He'd wear seersucker suits. He had his matching belt and his shoes and his flair. And everywhere he went with this incredible love of people. I mean, he would talk to anybody. He would sign autographs for hours. He would pose for photographs. He sang, he danced. When he was at a ball game, he just talked to everybody all over. And there was the time early on in their road trip when they were down in Houston for an Astros game. And at the end of an inning, one of the players, the right fielder, tossed a ball up into the stands. And there was a little boy there in an Astros jersey, had his mitt, kind of reached for it. But there was a bigger guy, a man, he was, 30 something. He had on a nice suit and his tie was loose. And he kind of reached out and he grabbed the ball. And Posnanski said, "What a jerk. Man, he should have let that little kid have the ball. What a jerk." And Buck O'Neil said, "Don't be so hard on him. Maybe he's got a kid of his own at home." And Posnanski thought, gosh, I hadn't even thought about that. So he tried to picture this little boy at home sleeping on the Astros sheets and his father coming in that night with the ball. "Look what I got you, and tomorrow when I get home, we'll play catch." But then Posnanski said, "Yeah, well, if he's got a kid, why didn't he bring him to the ball game?" And Buck O'Neil said, "Maybe his kid was sick." I mean, that was Buck O'Neil. He had this incredible heart and generous spirit for everyone. He almost never talked about the challenges and the setbacks and the slights that they suffered as Negro Leagues player. He almost never talked about the racism, about the stale sandwiches that they had to eat because, especially in the South, restaurants wouldn't serve them. Buses carried them to towns where people didn't really want them. Even after the black players made it into the major leagues, you could hit the winning run and you could still end up eating in the kitchen while the rest of the team sat in the hotel dining room. When he did talk about the racism, it was almost in a poem. One day, near the end of the trip, they were traveling through Washington, D.C. It was autumn, late fall, and Buck was looking out the window at the Capitol. He could see it in the distance. And he started talking about the Zulu cannibal giants. He almost never talked about the Zulu cannibal giants because it was so humiliating. It was in 1937, and Buck was really hungry. And the Zulus were a team that played for white audiences. The men, proud men, had to wear grass skirts. They played in bare chest and war paint. They were given African-sounding names. They had bats that looked like clubs. And in the middle of the innings, they had to dance. And whenever Buck talked about it, he always insisted that he had never danced. But this day, driving through D.C., he was gazing out the window at the Capitol, and he told that story. And Poznanski said he knew he told that story because it was about this country. It was about what this country was about. That's the gaze we find this morning on Jesus' face as he comes into the temple. This isn't the usual Jesus we're used to, right? This is the only time he performs a negative miracle where he damns the fig tree. We're used to Jesus, joyful, calling the disciples, the little children up into his lap, reaching out to the woman caught in adultery, healing the man born blind and the one with the withered hand, and feeding the thousands on a hillside. But this is a different Jesus. He comes in and he looks around that temple, that place where so many people have been cut out of the access, this place that has become a symbol of exploitation and extortion. And on his face, there's anger, but there's also sadness. It's someone who looks at something they love and sees how broken it is. I think about those Sandy Hook parents. You remember in 2013 how they were gathered in the Senate chamber for that historic vote when this country was going to finally do something and pass universal background checks and put a ban on assault rifles. And do you remember the look on their face when 46 senators bought by the gun lobby couldn't vote for it? The rage, the anger, the sadness. That's the gaze this morning. Someone who looks at something they love so much and sees how very broken it is. But in this Holy Week, we're told that we're not just to look at the gaze outside, but to turn it inward as well, right? And to see what needs to change in ourselves. If you've been around, you've heard me talk about one of my challenges, which is controlling, especially my children, 23 and 26, in part because I want to protect them. You know, I've gone through some rough things, and I never want them to hurt that way. But a few weeks ago, I really tried to think more about it, and I realized that some of the control is about projection. And this isn't something I'm proud to admit, but some of it is because I have come to see my children as a reflection of me, that their success is my success and their failure is somehow my failure. And that's something I'm embarrassed to admit because that's not love, that's conditional, right? And yet this week is this invitation for us to try to see what it is we do that is broken and needs to change. And I know I'm not the only one who projects a certain image, who wants to see that the angle is as good as it can be. Sherry Turkle teaches at MIT. She's taught for years and written about technology and screens and how it changes us. Nothing more than this year, right? She talks about how her students have actually come to prefer Zoom because they can control so much what other people see about them. They can control the angle and the look and their voice, and they can be less vulnerable. I mean, we're so much more vulnerable, really, when we're really with one another. I thought about a young law student I was talking to this week for the first time, her first year of law school. She has got it all going on. She's smart, she's bright, she's enchanting, she's engaging, she's attractive, she's at a prestigious law school. And she was saying how really rough it's been. She thought of herself as a really good writer. She got to law school. Oh my gosh, she's struggling. She's in classes. There's 125 people. She doesn't know any of them. And she's the only person who appears to struggle. Everybody else is putting up this face like they've got it all going on and they're not confused by any of the material. This is the week when we're invited to look inward at really what we got to let go of. Maybe it's the drinking, maybe it's the relationship that has to be different, maybe it's the controlling, maybe who knows? And the sweet thing about this week is that this is a week when God's love comes at us so strong, when the unconditional love of God is just so brilliant, right? When God on the cross looks at us, forgive them, for they know, before we've even asked for forgiveness, there's this incredible grace and acceptance. That's the love that Buck O'Neil took with him everywhere he went. He talked about God, God's love, agape. He forgave so easily, Posnanski said. It didn't even seem like he was forgiving. And it was that love that he needed more than ever on the day of the Hall of Fame vote. The Hall of Fame, that's a tender subject for the Negro Leagues players because it really represents how they were overlooked. Their home runs and their pitching and their games, their pizzazz, their flair. And anywhere there's a group of Negro Leagues players, 80, 90, 100, there's talk about the Hall of Fame and how they want to be in it. In 2006, the good people at Cooperstown finally decided to make it right. And they gathered together a big team who would evaluate 39 players and decided, and managers, and who would make it in. It was a big day, and everybody knew that Buck O'Neil was a foregone conclusion. Only Buck and Minnie Minoso were the only two of the players on the list who were still alive. And of course, Buck is the face of the Negro Leagues. If it weren't for Buck, there wouldn't be a Negro Leagues museum. They wouldn't have been having the vote that day. And so he arrived at the Negro Leagues day at the museum that morning at 10 a.m. And he'd come casual, 94 years old. He had his jeans, his Monarchs jersey, his bomber jacket, his cap. Bob Kendrick, who directs the museum, who's like a son to him, along with Posnanski, another son, were there, along with a lot of reporters. Buck asked, when will they call? Probably 11. So Buck had some time. He called his cousin in Sarasota, Florida, 93 years old. They'd played ball together as kids. She was going to be there at Cooperstown when he was elected. And I don't really know what to say, but most of you know that the call never came. It was just incomprehensible. When Bob Kendrick went out there to talk to the reporters, he sobbed. Posnanski was enraged. The next day, the New York Times, and after that, 50 more papers in this country wrote op-eds about how horrible this decision was. Hank Aaron began a big plot to change it. Hillary Clinton, Senator of New York, said it had to be changed. They came in, they told Buck. He was disappointed. I don't know if I mentioned it, but it was the one thing in his life that he really wanted. He was disappointed, and he said, I really wanted always to be a Hall of Famer. It took him maybe 5 minutes. And then he said, who got in? Well, there were 17. 17! Oh my God, Posnanski just about lost it. And Buck said, can I see the list? And he began going through it. I'm so happy. Oh my gosh, how deserving. So glad he got in. And then he looked at Joe Posnanski and he said, I wonder who they'll ask to speak. That was a good question. Who could speak at the ceremony? I mean, after all, everyone was gone. And then he said, I wonder if they'll ask me. And Posnanski said he nearly that's just the biggest slight ever. But of course, a few months later, under a hot summer sky, there was Buck O'Neil giving the speech. And it's a speech. I mean, Kennedy, we're going to go to the moon. Dr. King, I have a dream. It's that kind of a speech. He stood up there, and in front of that lawn, the black and white faces, he began to preach. He talked about how he was the luckiest man on earth, how much he loved playing for the Negro Leagues, how much they could play. Oh my gosh, and of all the places he could ever be, there'd never been anywhere, any moment that he would rather be than standing right there to honor those new 17. He talked about them, and then again, he started preaching. He talked about God's love, as Martin King talked about it, agape, this unconditional love. You don't love people because you like them or you agree with them. You love them because God made them, and God doesn't make anyone ugly. And he went on and on about his love, and then he said, well, I guess I've finished my 6 minutes up here, but before I go, I want you all to do something for me. I want you all to take hands. Everybody, you got your hands? And he looked out there like he did everywhere he went. He wanted them to sing his favorite song, a gospel song from the 70s. Repeat after me. I see you, black brothers and sisters. I know you can sing. I don't know about you white people. Can you sing? The greatest thing in all my life, is loving you. Come on, people, sing. The greatest thing in all my life, is loving. This man who was expected to play baseball in a grass skirt stood up there and he looked at that crowd with such love. His gaze of such incredible grace. Believe me, there was no one there who wasn't a believer. In all my life is loving you. That's the song that will carry us into this week. Amen.